Hey, Whiskey Ringers. I am thrilled to welcome back Impex Beverages as the Whiskey Ring Podcast presenting sponsor. Each month, we'll be talking about a new set of single casks, maybe feature a chosen distillery, or single cask from a chosen distillery. Listen for the mid-roll for more info on this month's offerings. And now, a brand new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. We are continuing our somewhat unintentional Irish theme for recording this month with Waterford Distillery. So this is a distillery out of, you guessed it, Waterford in Ireland, but they're doing a few things a little bit differently. And if you've seen some of my posts about some of their products, they were also an award winner, the Whiskey Ring Awards at the end of the year last year. I'm kind of a big fan of theirs, so I'm thrilled to bring on Mark Newton to represent Waterford Distillery and make it through my gauntlet of questions. So Mark, welcome.
Well, thanks very much for a start, for engaging so deeply about Waterford. I mean, you're our kind of drinker. You're a very curious person. So yeah, happy to shoot the breeze with you.
Absolutely. So, let's kick it off with a brief origin story of Waterford.
Of Waterford. Well, brief is the challenge. I'll try and be very brief on this. I suppose everyone knows Mark Rainier, the guy who probably most will probably know him from Bruichladdich when he resurrected Bruichladdich. But of course, Mark, and I mean, I suppose all of the bits I'll tell you quickly have a direct influence on Waterford, actually. So Mark was a wine merchant, importer, bottler in London, owned a wine store there, and then got absorbed into it's a fantastic story in and of itself, which I won't go into, but it involved a very expensive bottle of whiskey that he won. He got into he bought Bruichladdich in 2000, end of 2000, beginning of 2001, and sold out in 2012. And he was in the wilderness. But Mark, obviously being a wine person, coming from that wine background, a lot of the ideas that you see at Waterford today, biodynamics, terroir, that comes straight from his experience as a wine merchant in the 1980s and 90s. He was exploring the ideas of terroir as the French were, I suppose, rediscovering it to various generations coming back to the land. The ideas of biodynamics were really being talked about in Alsace and in other parts of France. Châteauneuf-du-Pape, I think that's where Mark first came across it. So these are all sort of feeding into the mix, and he finds himself in 2014 with a blank sheet of paper. How would he do this from scratch if he was going to do it from scratch? And there are two sort of key points that feed into it. One was the chief engineer at Bruichladdich, Duncan McGilvery. He always said the best barley in the world that he ever came across always came from the southeast of Ireland. In fact, it would have come out of Waterford Port, ironically, and that was being distilled in Scotland. I mean, there's something right there, isn't there? Barley from another country being distilled in another country, and it's still Scotch whiskey. But that's a sort of side issue. But he always remembered there was good quality barley coming from this part of the world. And then in 2014, a Guinness brewery, a former Guinness brewery, comes up for sale, and it was built in 1792, reconfigured at extraordinary expense into a state-of-the-art brewery in, I think it's 2004. And then, for reasons that never quite seem apparent, the stroke of an accountant's pen or something like that, Guinness withdraws into Dublin. So it used to make a Guinness extract for export. So it's a really high-tech facility, and it just came on the market. Now, for the real old guard amongst your listeners will remember there were a pair of stills, or one still, copper still, outside the front of Bruichladdich for many years. In fact, as a whiskey nerd, I managed to go on honeymoon and to say to my wife, who just wanted to go to a Scottish island. So I said, well, if you're going to go to any Scottish island, you may as well go to Islay. I don't know why. I'm sure there's something interesting there. And I had a photo taken in front of one of the stills, which Mark said had brought over to Waterford Distillery, obviously not knowing that was going to be the future of that those stills. So it's this sort of fortunate occurrence of this brewery just magically coming for sale at the right time when Mark had the resources and had the investors from his time at Bruichladdich to come and back him and say, you know what, you're mad enough to give it another go. And with this blank sheet of paper, how would you do all of this stuff from scratch? How would you? I guess actually, what is Waterford trying to do? It's quite cool to think of Mark talking about his days as an independent bottler with the Murray McDavid brand. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's still going today. But Mark was bottling really aged, really old, interesting whiskies, really old stocks, and they just sort of ran out, and he couldn't find the compelling whiskey. So Mark's always tried to set out to either, in my interpretation of it, rediscover this sort of glorious age of single malt, really flavorsome, flavor driven, no corner cutting spirit production, versus this idea of, well, actually, how do they create complexity in the wine world? It's a totally different view on what complexity is and how to assemble that. Terroir being a sort of building block of complexity, and you're layering them together in cuvées to create literally more flavor as an approach. And that's sort of all informs Waterford, really. That's the background to it. And I suppose, how did I come into this? Well, I mentioned I was the whiskey nerd. I was a whiskey, in my spare time, I was a writer. The website Malt Review, which became me writing bits and pieces for magazines, including Whiskey Magazine. And somehow, I think it was actually a random story on writing the history of the railways in Speyside, which was my first gig for Whiskey Magazine. And being a desperate whiskey writer, I thought, yes, I'll do that, and didn't know anything about railways and had to go and do some research, which was quite interesting. And became a regular reviewer for Whiskey Magazine, a taster actually for a year. I was one of the tasters for Whiskey Magazine. And so I was the nerd who had always been a fan of what Mark had done at Bruichladdich. So I was writing about some of the Islay barley whiskies when they first came out. I was I think what happened at that period of time, pre-acquisition Bruichladdich, just got me so excited about whiskey. I just thought, this is great. This is against the grain of the industry. There's some mad stuff going on. There was all sorts of interesting bottlings they were putting out. But this idea of, I suppose, you had the old distillery stocks and moving into the new production. You'll see this sort of sea change in Bruichladdich at a certain point in its production career, where it had Mark would describe it as he didn't buy a distillery. He bought a load of stock, and it came with a distillery, and they had to try and sell and position the stocks that they had to help raise money to fund distillation of their own barley, Scottish barley, Islay barley. So you have this old stock which was made under a very different way, transitioning to the newer stuff. So I think it's 2000, mid 2007. They distilled Rockside Farm, I think it was. Anyway, so the Islay barley whiskies, the idea of terroir. That was really the first time anyone had talked about it. So I've been an admirer from the late 2000s hens. Not 2010s, 2000, between 2008 and 2012 when it got sold. I was really peak whiskey nerd at that point, and so I just decided. Anyway, Whiskey Magazine. This is what it was. Whiskey Magazine was doing a feature on Irish, the new wave of Irish distilleries, and it was 2015. And I said, you know what, this pretty exciting happening in Waterford. You probably want to speak to this guy, and I'll go and I'll speak to him. So I'd actually at about the same time interviewed Mark from Malt Review, the website, which was, I think, the first interview with Mark since he'd bought Waterford, the site at Waterford. And so I had a conversation with him. We got into the detail, and he said, I might need some help. Do you want to come for dinner? I think we went for dinner in Edinburgh. And I said something ridiculous. I mean, bearing in mind, this is a whiskey hero. So, no apologies for being a bit pathetic about it. But I said something along the lines of, you know what, I'd give my right arm to be involved in a project of this nature. So started off doing some communications, and that became more and more. And suddenly, we needed a bottle. So involved in the project to come up with a bottle, work with a great agency around that, and step by step, here I am, heading up the brand. And so also alongside this, the whiskey journey was building Mark building Renegade Rum Distillery in Grenada, which I won't go too much into the details of that, but it's it's pretty much the same energy as Waterford is with whiskey, a little bit more precise. And there's a difference there, that whereas in barley, we don't run the farms, we source the barley from the growers, but in Grenada we run the farms ourselves. So it's an extra layer of involvement. But I think I tried to condense that into a few minutes anyway.
No, I think that was a fantastic condensation, and people know that we do a lot of research for these episodes to almost skip that question, if you will, but or to condense it, and we very rarely get to go into it too much. But just to throw out some of the names of the sites and podcasts that I've pulled from, if you want to hear more about the origin story of it, obviously Malt Review, you're right up also for Whiskey Magazine, Whiskey Topic, a Whiskey Cast episode from March of 2018, when just before the first distillate was being bottled at Waterford. Whiskey Sisters podcast. There are a number of and of course the numerous interviews that Mark Rainier and the rest of the team have given as well. So there's plenty of sources to also go into more depth on the origin. But I think that was a pretty damn good condensation, I gotta say.
It's not easy getting these stories into 5 minutes. I remember someone the other day asked Mark, "Well, how did you come to buy Bruichladdich then?" And I just have to walk away, because that was going to be another half an hour of how that happened. Because so we do well to condense these stories. But I think that's I suppose one of the great things about these projects is it's an awful lot to say, and it all begins and ends with production. Really, we're not spinning stories at the other end. It's all talking about where flavor comes from. I mean, that's ultimately what the projects are about. So yeah, we do. They're complex issues. They need a lot of time to unpack.
Absolutely. So you mentioned in the intro that Mark, we're gonna call him Mark R, because we've got Mark N on
Mark
here.
R, yes.
But Mark R, come from a wine background, and then buying and owning Bruichladdich for several years. Also reminds me, I do have a bottle of that Rockside Farm whiskey, and it's excellent. Both of those were both implicitly and explicitly involved in terroir. It was an integral part of certainly in the wine world, and then Mark kind of made it part of Bruichladdich as much as possible. And there's a whole podcast series that could just go off that question and premise alone. But in coming to Ireland and in creating Waterford, was there a concern that this idea of terroir that was already kind of facing a little bit of resistance in the Scotch world would face the same resistance in Ireland, particularly by the Scots coming in to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't want to speak for the Irish view on things. I come at it from the outside and looking in on that world, but I think there was a lot more open-mindedness in Ireland for a lot of the Waterford project. Actually, Mark does speak about the resistance in Scotland in production of that approach to production. Why should we bother doing it like this? We've always done it this other way. And of course, Scotch is a lot more, it's older, it's more entrenched in that way of doing things. So yeah, I think in terms of Ireland, it even in what you can produce in Ireland, there's a lot more that you can do. So maybe inherently within Ireland, there is more of an open mind, and certainly, I think I've not really come across any what we tend to call terroir denial. We've not really come across much of that in Ireland. It mostly comes from not just Scotland, actually, I'd say England. A lot of it comes from people in England, and you get the odd producer in Scotland who says, they used to distill two different barley varieties and they couldn't discern much difference, which is not necessarily incorrect, which I can get into a little bit later. But a lot of modern barley varieties share too much genetic material, so they're not that different. So you wouldn't get that much difference. But we certainly. So I mean, to address that point in a couple of ways. Mark had become he'd become used to a sense of resistance in the industry. And I say this in a very hand wavy kind of way, like what is the industry? It's made up of so many different personalities and views and opinions anyway. But there is a way of thinking like this isn't how you do things. So he'd already experienced that. And actually, from a production point of view, so there's an academic and a production point of view. The production point of view is he knew what he needed to do to do this properly. Because I don't think even at Bruichladdich, it was testing, it was trialing, but they didn't have a couple of things that they needed to do. What I would say you really need a claim if you're going to make a claim to be terroir driven, which is not just about local barley. I think that's the starting point, but it's about different sources of local barley. It doesn't have to be local. You could get, as long as it's kept separate, and that's the key thing. As long as they're kept separate, then you can start to experiment and taste differences from different places and detect an influence of terroir. But you need something which is very boring to describe, but it's a bespoke barley storage facility. There's a great paper by Rob Arnold on terroir in Bourbon, and actually I think it's to do with different grains of corn rather than specifically on terroir. But he says if you're going to do this seriously as a producer, you need to be able to keep all these individual crops individual and keep them in their separate bays and keep them completely isolated from the moment they're harvested all the way through production to the moment you distill it and then in barrel. You need to keep that entirely separate. So we had to build what we call the Cathedral of Barley, which is a bespoke storage warehouse that keeps all of the crops separately. And the whole it's the logistical center of our entire operation. It's kind of the unsung hero. And he didn't have that at Bruichladdich. He didn't necessarily have that facility to keep all of these grains separate. So he came in with a production view, like, okay, I'm going to do it seriously. This is what I need. And he kind of, I don't want to say he tested it at Bruichladdich. He was doing it at Bruichladdich, but now it was on another scale entirely. So he'd learned what the resistance was. He'd learned what he needed, and blank sheet of paper to do it. And again, in Ireland, he would describe this as everyone's up for the challenge. There's no resistance. No, why should we do that? And we've been fortunate with our partners, Minch Malt, who are a small malting facility, to help set that up. And I mentioned the academic side as well. And this is something he was working on from day one when he was in Ireland. Mark had always been told, oh, there's no proof of terroir in whiskey. Why should we believe you? So he set out to find a team of scientists who could help demonstrate what everyone in the world. I mean, the thing that gets me about terroir is we've gone to such great lengths, but it's such a bloody obvious thing. If you plant something in one place, it's going to grow differently to how it grows in another, and you're going to get different flavors from those places. This is the case for all kinds of food, all kinds of drinks, spirits and wines and everything in between. And why is whiskey any different? Why would it assume it's any different? Well, maybe because it's not in most people's interests for terroir to be a good thing. If you pick apart the fact that you can grow it in different places in the same country and you get different flavors, what's it going to mean when you can ship barley halfway across the world and still pass it off as Scotch or whatever? And where's the provenance? So I think this is the crux of it. It exposes a lot of awkward questions. So with the academic work in particular, we found a guy who actually wrote a paper on a very similar experiment in beer and terroir and beer. A guy with a wonderfully appropriate name, Dr. Dustin Herb, who is a great young scientist. Annoyingly, he looks a bit like Clark Kent, Superman. He's a good-looking scientist, which is so smart as well. So he's a very, very bright guy. So he'd already written about this in beer, and Mark had come across this paper and said, "Look, what would it take to look at this in whiskey? Because it's only an extra stage as part of the process." So Dustin and Chuggas, which is the Irish state, I think it's sort of private and public hybrid agricultural body, so the government agricultural body, and a team involving some Waterford staff and our maltsters. It's quite a broad team who came together to study the influence of terroir in lab conditions, I should say, it makes it watertight. Who can and to sort of basically it was two varieties grown in two different locations across different harvests, and it used gas chromatography. Sorry, actually more than that. It's gas chromatography, olfact. I can never even pronounce. I'm not even going to bring it in to pronounce the full thing. But a very clever bit where you can see the compounds and identify them with sensory analysis at the same time. And so it's very, very clever stuff. And well, hey presto, there's terroir. It exists. Who knew? So that's the lab-based thing, and we're actually extending the academic work into, just going back to what I said about the production side, keeping all of these crops separately. We've built up a library of well over 100 single farm origins, distinct distillations. I mean, this is the thing about Waterford. Every week, pretty much every week, we're distilling an inherently different Waterford whiskey. It comes from a different farm, or it's a different barley variety, or it's a heritage variety, or a biodynamic, or an organic, or a peated. Everything is completely different. It's not like we've got the same homogenous blob of Waterford whiskey, which we're finishing this barrel or whatever, just to create another product. They're inherently different. They're each a distinct thing in their own right. So we've built up an extraordinarily large library of spirit, and this is what Angelita at the distillery oversees with Dustin Herb and Neil Conway, our head brewer. We're essentially over 4 or 5 harvests now, and we're mapping out with a sensory panel terroir, basically all of the variety in flavors that we're getting. It's been run through a sensory panel. We're recording it all, and we're going to put that through the great academic machine to see, well, what are we getting? Because we've had a few harvests now, so we should really start to unpack what this is looking like. And even if you took terroir out of the equation, I find the organics and the biodynamics question quite interesting as well, because there's like a scale, and it goes up to 15 on the malty, fruity, dried fruits, the various sort of sensory attributes of different spirits. The conventional varieties go up to about more or less 5 or whatever on the scale, and each individual one. The organics grade a little bit higher. They're scoring up to 7 on these sensory scales, and the biodynamics in a pleasingly spinal tap way hit 11. They go up to 11 on the sensory scale. So it's fascinating. We're learning about all of this stuff. We didn't have any answers to begin with, but it's pretty cool finding out along the way. And maybe it was a kind of leap of faith at the start. Mark would have known from what he was doing at Brookladley that there are going to be differences. So perhaps it was less of a leap of faith for him, I suspect. But to be able to sort of play with all of these now and just see the variety we're getting, particularly on some of the heritage grains as well. It's a very enjoyable experience. So I'm not sure what the question was. Actually, it's something to do with resistance, wasn't it? To terroir and well, actually, this is a good point. I suppose all of what I've talked about and explained is, we've gone out of our way to demonstrate, to show, to bring people along with us. Actually, we weren't trying to hit people over the head with this stuff. We were just curious, and we wanted other people to be curious as well. And actually, to just simply not deny outright without even being open-minded enough to do this idea. Now, as I said, why should whiskey be any different to any other drinks industry on the planet? What's so special about barley that it's different to every other crop? So I think with all of that work, with all of this, the narrative around Waterford, people are open-minded, and particularly the new generation of drinkers, or people who maybe weren't. Well, I tell you what, let's put it this way: you can go to some whiskey shows with Waterford, and there's a couple of types of drinkers. Broadly speaking, there are many people who are into their age statements. They don't necessarily want to know about the raw materials. They possibly want to just collect various age statements of the favourite. That's fine, but they're not really interested at all in what Waterford has to say, and that's okay. They've got their own sandbox to play, and that's always something for everyone. But there's very much a different type of drinker, and I would say it's a newer. It's not really new anymore, but there's definitely a sea change, and has been a sea change in the types of people coming into whiskey who are really interested in flavour. They want to know actually what's in their drink and where it came from and what are these differences. Times are changing. So the resistance, I think, has gone away. You still get the odd grumble out there. I quite enjoy I mean, my favorite grumble is actually not to do with terroir. It's when someone comes up to me and says, "Oh, biodynamic, it's all marketing, isn't it?" And I get quite, I get quite lively about that. But yeah, I don't think there's really resistance today anywhere near like the sort of the wars we used to get into when we first set out. And it was quite hard. It's psychologically quite hard. You know, you've got people just message on Twitter or just not abuse because we've got fairly thick skins about all of this stuff. But it was fairly dicey for a long period of time anyway. And particularly since the academic project was out there, and people have been able to taste and explore along with us, I think it's kind of gone away, to be honest. Yeah, I mean that was a very long answer, probably even a different answer for a different question, but it hopefully I covered some of that off for you.
Absolutely no. And it did touch on a couple other topics that we're gonna get to, which is completely fine. And before going on to the next question, I just wanted to mention that one of the little tidbits you said was that England, in particular, was a somewhere where there was perhaps more resistance than in Ireland or even in Scotland, and it mirrors a conversation I had recently with John Glazer, a Compass Box, which would be another episode coming out pretty soon, actually, if it hasn't come out before this episode, and where he was saying, you know, when he was first those two first casks of hedonism that he created as a blend, the people in Scotland were thinking, oh, this is great, this is interesting, this could potentially save our industry as it was pretty stagnant or even dropping. And yet people in England, particularly in London, were very against it. It was, yeah, it's a blend, it's grain whiskey, it's this or that. So it was actually an easier sell in Glasgow and Edinburgh than it was in London. And as you were describing the kind of path that Waterford took and the path that the term terroir in whiskey, it just seemed to parallel quite nicely with John's experience as well. So maybe it's just something stodgy about being in the South. Who knows?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Cultural differences, cultural divide. I mean, I've always felt, you know, Waterford being Irish might get a harder time in Scotland. I mean, it's certainly interesting, isn't it? You sort of, you know, I get to see behind some of the online comments on a sort of macro scale. So seeing Facebook comments, you know, we might run a post and, you know, one of the biggest gripes is, oh, you're spelling whiskey wrong. And then you have to, actually, it's quite a delight to point out to people that actually they're wrong. But you do tend to see quite a lot of Scottish sort of, you know, I don't know what it is, just very base, simple national rivalry against Irish whiskey and the Irish producing it. So it's a different kind of, it's not, I wouldn't call that intellectual in the slightest. It's just very base reaction from the Scots to the Irish. But yeah, the English, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. You would have thought, you know, being exposed to sort of other types of drinks and you know, wine or whatever, the people might be more open-minded. I don't know. Yeah, who knows on that? Who knows? Maybe it's the type of whiskey drinker, the collector, of someone who was used to the pretty good days where Port Ellen cost 40 quid a bottle, and you know, well, those times have changed, unfortunately. Yeah, who knows?
Man, those days. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I can't remember it being £40. I think it was £80 a bottle. That's probably the one I can remember. But even so,
I'd take that. I'd take that for even an 8-10-year-old Port Ellen at this point. I would take that, for sure.
And then all of Japanese whiskey, and
oh my god,
Karua's
Japanese, yeah.
I drank so much Karua's unless it was 10 years ago or 11 years ago. Yeah, probably 11 years ago when you could get that quite easily. Now you think the prices that's going up now, it's just insane. But hey, I enjoy drinking it at least.
Yeah, now Shizuoka Distillery has the old stills from Karuizawa, or one of the stills from Karuizawa, and has been distilling on it. And it's about to come out, at least in the US market. I think it's been out in Japan. It's coming to the US market around now. I got a taste to try the Prologue K, which was that kind of sample bottle, almost like an EP instead of a CD. Wow, just showed my age. And even at 5 to 6 years old, the stuff from the Karuizawa stills, even in a new distillery, is excellent. It's so good.
Yeah.
But it's also like $300 or 200 for a 500 ml bottle. So
that's, yes, okay. they know what they're doing then, don't they?
Oh yeah, they know the name carries the weight. For sure. At Waterford, so many things about Waterford, so much about what Waterford does seems and probably is very intentional. You're intentionally using, for example, certain controls, like the same yeast strains, the same or very similar casking for across the board, as many controls as possible, so that you can show both scientifically and qualitatively that terroir exists, that there's a difference between them. So if you shut off all the other controls, you can say, all right, this is the only variable. This is the thing that's changing, i.e., because the two products taste differently, therefore the changes in the barley or the biodynamic versus organic.
Yeah. I mean that's you've hit the nail on the head there. We want the barley to talk. But then again, what is whiskey made from? Why does it not taste like a rye or a bourbon? It's because of the grain, because it is made from barley. So barley is what we are primarily interested in. But the thing to stress, I guess, is I would say it's like giving every farm's crop of barley the same opportunity through the distillery, but it will behave differently. And that's something we don't control, and we wouldn't want to. We want to let the barley do its own thing, and that comes from the moment it is at the distillery. The grains can be different sizes, so a head brewer will have to adjust the hydro mill, which is a very unusual anaerobic wet mill. It's not the harsh milling, the dry milling that the industry tends to get. It's got a hydro mill, which was again this bonkers bit of kit left in from the old brewery. You just wouldn't get that in a distillery. And so he'll have to adjust the mill gap to accommodate different sizes of grains, and then and again, this is from different harvests, different crops. They'll begin to behave differently all the way through. We've got some very unusual kit. We've got what we call our technological trinity. The hydro mill is the first part of that. We've got an incremental mash converter, so it's not a mash tun. It's this converter that goes through to a mash filter. You do see one or two of these around, and the mash filters, again, very unusual bit of kit to get in a distillery, but it's like a series of pneumatic plates squeezing the hell out of the water from the draft. So again, to get you can run that in two ways. You can run it for economy to just blitz through it all really quickly, I suppose, or you can run it for flavor maximization. And I think that's the fundamental point of the Waterford project. We're not actually running a science experiment, because that's not very fun to taste. Well, we've got the science experiment running parallel. It is about creating the most flavoursome litre of alcohol possible, and not the cheapest. That starts with barley. We let it do its thing through we've got this unusual kit to begin with. The mash filter, we speculatively, does that give us more polyphenols? There's questions about this kit. It's just not been used before, so it's really fascinating. The fermentation, okay, yes, it's a standard use across all of the farms. So we don't want to influence that barley. We don't want to get it. And actually, there's ways even in Ireland you can influence the barley, even in malting. You can add various things, enzymes to the malting process, which we do not do. We want it to be completely, and this is things that don't get talked about. We want it to be totally natural. The fermentation, we allow about 120 hours per single farm origin distillation, and yet some can go on for a lot longer than that. We allow for a secondary, and that allows for a secondary malolactic fermentation to take place, which is something more commonly associated with the wine world. And then we run the stills low and slow. It basically a third of the rate the stills are meant to run at. Trickle distillation, and we take a very stingy middle cut. We don't want to impinge on the not the nasties as such, but we want clean purity of flavor, and so we leave. I can't remember what the calculation is now, but we leave a hell of a lot of potential whiskey on the table, because we don't want to infringe on that. I think it's like a floating 10-degree middle cut. And then that goes into the best wood money can buy, and that's a lesson Mark learned directly at Brookladdy. I said he bought a load of stock that came with a distillery. Well, he would tell you a lot of that stock came in very, very tired wood that had been used 6-7 times over. It was doing nothing for the whiskey, and he had to buy some good wood, and then started the process of, I think he called it acing at the time, advanced cask evolution. something along those lines, which is now more commonly known as finishing, and has pretty much been abused by every distillery on the planet now as another way to eke out different ways of different products anyway. But Mark learned that you need good wood from the start. So we don't finish because we start properly in the best oak on the planet. And because it's Ireland, not just oak, we can experiment with acacia, wild cherry, and a few other oddities that we've got tucked away, which in my view are nowhere near as good as oak. I think oak is best for a reason. And we've got some even unusual oak species. We've got Andean oak from Colombia, for example, but the most of it is French and American, either fresh, first fill or virgin oak. But it is some of the most expensive barrels on the planet. At one stage, a third of our production cost was on wood. I don't know what that is post war in Ukraine and what that's done to fluctuation prices and energy prices and all the shit show that's come off the back of that. But we're spending just proportionally more. Mark would say more than any other distillery is spending on wood. And we don't even talk about the wood. We're talking about the barley because it's the stuff that goes into the cask. That's where the flavour is. And yes, it's ameliorated by wood, but we have a different cask. You identify we have a similar portfolio for each distillation, and that's so we can actually put together a harmonious bottling of each single barley. Like I said, each one is a different Waterford whiskey. What is Waterford? It's just this myriad of very different individual, unique, from the ground up, literally from the ground up, different whiskies. So again, I've forgotten what the question was about control. Yes, so we give everything the same opportunity. It goes into the same sort of process, but it's behaving differently. And again, when that distillate is in cask, it behaves differently. It's fascinating. It's weird. I remember just some really good times in head distiller Ned's lab, and he just sort of puts together prototypes, and you think, well, how are some just different to others? And from different counties, just tasted. Some didn't have as much life at 2 or 3 years, and some other regions. It was really interesting. And then you put the heritage grains in there, and they're behaving differently as well. And some are just, the spirit goes into the car. Like take Hunter, for example, and our heritage grain Hunter, which was introduced in 1959, phased out in 1972. Really known affectionately in the brewing world in particular. We were working with with the Department of Agriculture, and who propagated from scratch from a 50-gram packet of seeds enough barley to have a distillation, and very exciting, very very sort of cutting edge stuff, even though it's sort of going back in time, because I mentioned earlier most modern barley varieties. In fact, this is one of the things with our academic work. We couldn't attribute flavor variation to barley variety in the same way that we could to terroir. Why would that be the case? And so going back to that, the possible distiller who 20 years ago said they tried a couple of different barley varieties and there wasn't much difference. Well, maybe they were right, because they're basically cousins or kissing, brothers and sisters. They're from the same lineage. They share too much genetic material to have much flavor variety. So if you want, and this is the same for tomatoes or any other kind of food stuff, and you look into it, there'll be people there moaning it didn't taste as good as it used to. Do you know what? They're right. It didn't, because all of the flavor, in very noble pursuits of increasing yield to be able to feed enough people. Although I'm not sure it's that noble in whiskey terms or beer terms. It's simply to have to increase yield has the expression of flavour been left to one side, and so that's what the Heritage Project was about. Very exciting, and yet when I tasted the spirits of Hunter, I wasn't that impressed. I was a bit disappointed. I thought this isn't as intriguing as some of the modern varieties. What's going on here? And yet, boy, after 3 years, that's one of my favourite whiskies by a long way. So you just don't know how this stuff behaves. It's genuinely very exciting. But yeah, we're learning. We're learning. Again, not sure what question I answered there, but yeah,
all good. Yeah, I noted originally that the barley varietals using the barley varietals being used today, it's usually either Concerto, Laureate, Golden Promise, something like that. And yeah, there's some flavor variation, but there's not a lot. It's very close to each other at this point. And but we're seeing a little bit different in at least the American sphere of doing more trials with rye varietals, for example. So in the same way that you brought back Hunter, us bringing back Rosen or Danko, these other varietals that have more flavor.
I mean, it's very interesting. So we've distilled Hunter, Goldthorpe, Old Irish, and we're exploring Sprat Archer and a few other heritage grains as well. So we're going back in time about, Goldthorpe was the turn of 1900s or thereabouts. Old Irish was perhaps a little bit earlier. It gets murky. The records aren't great on some of these things, but what the Department of Agriculture in Ireland have been doing for several years, actually. It was quite amusing to see recently in Scotland. I think it was Heriot Wotton or another research institute, and it hit the news in the BBC to say, "Hey, we think it's a good idea to start exploring all these heritage grains." And actually, well, where have you been the last 5-10 years? And everyone else has been doing it and banging on about the fact that there's a really interesting flavour to be found from the part. I mean, it's all good. I say that in jest. It's all very good that people have finally realised that the flavour starts with the grain. That's the source of the flavour. So why not exploit that? And that's literally what going back to the idea of Waterford being a flavour maximisation project. That's really it starts with the raw material. Well, how can you get as much flavour variation from the raw material? So terroir is the bleeding obvious one. Let's plant it in different places and see what it tastes like. That's one thing. Then there's the barley variety. Okay, if modern varieties aren't giving us much to work on, what does the past give us? Then there's how you farm it, organically or biodynamically. And the biodynamic stuff, I personally love. I love the sort of thinking behind it. I love what they're doing. I love actually how biodynamics has influenced even conventional agriculture today. People talk about soil regeneration as the hot topic in agriculture and farming. Yeah, but biodynamic guys, that's kind of what it was always about. Fundamentally, creating a microbially turbocharged soil to create very, very healthy, flavoursome plants that we could then get more flavour from. And it's very good. And now we've got our biodynamic growers are growing the heritage varieties, and so they're crossing the streams, which is quite interesting as well, because I think they saw converting to biodynamics, the yield is less. Heritage varieties, the yields are inherently less. But when the heritage varieties were grown on the biodynamic farm, they saw a little uplift, because the heritage varieties, take Hunter, for example, they've got much longer roots than modern varieties. So the Hunter, it's quite good. I'm sure we've got some pictures online somewhere, which I'll try and dig out if I can. But you pull up the plant, and it's got much longer roots than a modern barley variety. So if you've created a really rich turbocharged soil, if the plant's got longer roots, it can just make more of that. And then the plant itself is going to be more stable, in droughts, for example, because its roots are going down slightly deeper. So it's just very interesting to see these old ways connecting in ways which we've probably forgotten about these days. And as a distiller, as someone, as a company who want to get flavour, that's pretty exciting stuff.
This month's Impact Spotlight is on Pokeno whiskey. Sitting just south of Auckland on the North Island of New Zealand, Pokeno is one of the Pacific Rim's newest distilleries. Founded by whiskey industry veteran Matt Johns, Pokeno set out to create a uniquely New Zealand single malt whiskey, one that would bring the lush, subtropical terroir into the world's most recognizable category of malt spirit. I've been able to try their Origin and their Discovery series, as well as a single-barrel double-matured ex-bourbon, and each were truly fantastic. And in case you're wondering whether I really do get to try these things that I talk about, or whether I even like them, I'm here to tell you yes to both. If I don't like it, I don't have to talk about it. And I can't stop talking about Pokeno to anyone who will listen. As of March 2023, Pokeno is just starting to come out into the US market with a rapidly growing footprint. I sometimes say that there are distilleries to watch. This is one to watch while sipping their already world-class single malts. Check out my episode with Matt and Pokeno in late March, and order your bottle of Pokeno New Zealand single malt today. Hey, Whiskey Ringers. I hope you've been taking advantage of that podcast-only code for the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society. They've got around 20 bottlings coming out each month, and there's never a shortage of new things to explore. To take advantage of this podcast-only offer, please go to smwsa.com, that's Scotch Malt Whiskey Society of America, and put in code WRP for Whiskey Ring Podcast at checkout for 25% off your first year subscription. All right, so before I forget, I actually want to move to the newest products in the Waterford lineup, or some of the newest products. So the three newest ones are, as you were just mentioning, the Heritage Hunter, as well as two new peated expressions, the Ballybannon and Fenniscourt. Now, if anyone has listened to my episode with James Doherty from Schlief League, you'll know that Irish whiskey used to be peated. It's not all the unpeated stuff from Middleton, Irish distillers, Bushmills that we've grown used to over the last century and a half. It did used to have peat almost across the board. Now, the slight difference there is that, unlike in Scotland where you had peat as well, but peat was used as a fuel source just as it was in Ireland, but there really were not many alternatives in Scotland. There's not a lot of wood there, certainly not now, especially. But in Ireland, you did have quite a bit of wood cover, at least in the Midlands and before you got to the really northern kind of tip of it. So wood was available as another biofuel before things like coal and natural gas came around.
Well, it's an interesting one for Ireland, because if you Google now, I don't know what the numbers are off the top of my head, but they were talking about banning burning peat for domestic fuel. I think this is probably a broader environmental sort of concern anyway. And interestingly, the peat needed for whiskey is different to the peat needed for fuel. But there's an alarming amount of people who now, well, not alarming, but alarming if they're going to cut off this as a fuel source. But a good number of people out there in rural Ireland are still using peat to warm their homes. So I think it's sort of more pervasive than it has been in the UK. Don't in Scotland, of course, when the coal started being shipped up by the railways up and down, that was a game changer for distillation. Actually, going back to my railways conversation, Mike,
I was thinking that, yeah,
on railways. That was 1850s, 1860s. This development of the railway to Speyside, taking up coal, barley, bringing down barrels of whiskey to be blended in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and then further afield. So I think that was probably the key difference. Of course, that's why Islay retains the peat, because it didn't have the railways to really it was all by sea. So anyway, going to Ireland, I don't know the precise history of peat and its sort of domestic fuel, but it's quite a high number of people now still rely upon peat as a fuel source. So it's really been part of that culture. And I think, it's further down in Ireland, you've got coal fields and other things. But really, as you identified, and as your other guests have identified, you're surrounded by peat. You need something to create heat. What are you going to use? Well, how about all of that peat that's just sitting outside? And that's what they used. And that's what whiskey tasted like. You can see adverts going back from, we've got a couple on file. I think it's going up north of the border to Bushmills and around, people celebrating the flavors of Irish peats in their whiskey. This is 18 whatever it was, I can't remember now, but interesting, the advertising records are quite a useful historical record for whiskey production. So yeah, the peated whiskies was this was an interesting project, because there was nowhere in Ireland that could safely being the key word, peat Irish whiskey, or peat whiskey, peat barley anyway. And I can't remember how it ever came to Waterford's a terroir project, and the peat sort of not sort of one of our it's not necessarily part of that barley terroir conversation, except for it makes it very interesting once you peat it and to see the influence of terroir afterwards. So we decided, well, let's peat a couple of these single farm origins and see what we get, and accept well, there's nowhere to do it in Ireland, which presents a bit of a problem. And being us, we have to use, we want to use Irish peat. Um,
Mm.
Perhaps out of stubbornness ultimately, but really definitely out of providence. We're using Irish barley, everything's done there. Well, we need Irish peat as well. So we managed to find a peat source. The first releases, it was from County Kildare, and but then we didn't have any facility. Well, we tried, we experimented. I've seen the pictures, and it looks hilarious of us trying to build something to do it ourselves, um, and it was a bit of a no go. You have to be really, really careful with peat because it can introduce potential carcinogens if you're not careful. So it's best left in the hands of people who know what they're doing. So Minch Malt are part of a broader malting group, and they have a sister malting facility in Glenesk in Scotland. So we shipped our barley and our peat all the way up to Scotland, across to Scotland, to be peated. And the guys there had never seen Irish peat before. This was new to them. They're used to working with different raw materials, so they had to sort of, what's this? This is weird. And then we did 2 single farm origins first year, shipped it back, distilled it, and kept it a secret, which I'm very pleased with because we're crap at keeping secrets. Because we get it. I mean, you've heard me; I just waffle on, but we like to talk a lot. And I remember at the time saying, wouldn't it be pretty cool if we just sprung this as a surprise on people and didn't tell them? And obviously, I know a few people did know about it because we are crap at keeping secrets and we do get jolly excited. And to be honest, there's not a lot you can do about the smell of peat in production for 2 weeks of the year when we're doing it. So we've then branched further afield to different peated sources and different single farm origins. And excitingly, we can revisit some of the farms which were unpeated in previous bottlings, and we can then compare it with peated versions of those as well. So we can have a bit of fun with this. But yeah, I mean, it's just this notion really. This was again, Waterford being a flavour project. Well, let's try different types of flavour sources. But again, with the peat, going to some of our other products, our headline acts are kind of, with time, will be more obviously the cuvées of this world. This idea of complexity, going back to what I said earlier about complexity of flavour, and with the wine world, you source individual components, little building blocks. So different single farm origins, different barley varieties, different farming sources, and then maybe peat as well. And you begin to layer those individual building blocks together to create more complexity. There's literally more going on. And can you create a sort of a mind fuck of a flavor experience by putting all of these things together? So the peat is really, on the one hand, yes, it's super nerdy. Yes, we can experiment with all these different locations and see what we get, and peat to different levels. But actually, it's just more for the ingredients cupboard. It's just more for us to sort of start to put together. And this is something that will become more apparent with time, as we sort of evolve. But at the minute, we're really sort of showing, letting people play along with us with a lot of these releases. And it will become more apparent with time what we can do with these ingredients afterwards. So yeah, the peats. Obviously different countries just love their peated whiskey, so it's been quite interesting from my side to see. Obviously the Germans love peated whiskey. They probably put it on their cornflakes. They just can't get enough of it. So it's been quite good to see the different nations. So, and again, I suppose people who may have been not against the Waterford principle, but there's parts of the community talking about terroir. Or who is this Waterford? Oh, and that's not for me. Well, suddenly you've got peated whiskey, and actually that is of interest to them. So it's been able to bring in to the conversation people who might have not really contemplated Waterford for a few years, and suddenly there's a new interesting thing for them to talk about. And of course, the great comparison is, how does Irish peat compare to Scottish peat, and to be able to taste those. So yeah, they've been really good fun. And I suppose it sort of rounds off our, what we call our Arcadian series, our farm origins. So, obviously single farm origins, the conventional ones, we're exploring terroir. Then we've got, in the Arcadian, we've got organic, heritage, biodynamic, and now peated. So it kind of rounds off, I suppose, that sort of side of the ingredients cupboard. I think with all of these things out there now, hopefully Waterford makes a bit more sense. It again, trying to not be in this ghetto of terroir, but terroir is it our be all and end all? It defines everything. It is our DNA. It is our entire infrastructure is built around terroir. But I didn't. I think it's quite good now that people can see that it's not just about terroir and hitting people over the head with terroir, which is actually quite an abstract thing, and it's been horribly corrupted by people in the industry already as a term. There's been all sorts of terms like social terroir have been floating around. Like, what on earth does that mean? Just because you don't know where your ingredients come from. Yeah, yes, people matter. That's wonderful. Yes, everyone has an influence on things, but just come up with your own word. Don't kind of appropriate another word and try and twist a very technical environmental word to describe the influence on growth and on flavor and make it into something else. So anyway, we're less about terroir now, and actually a fully rounded Waterford project, so people can see actually, they're hopefully people see they're very, very, if not obsessed, but very interested about flavor maximization. How can we get that most flavorsome liter of alcohol possible with all of these variables? And now people can see all of those variables. So I think that's hopefully what the peated has done, and the heritage as well. It's sort of made everyone realize that's what Waterford is about, and it's not just terroir. It's really about all of these flavor that starts with the grain, where it's grown, what type of grain it is, and how you grow it, and what you do to the grain. It's really all about barley.
And the peat in particular was, I mean, for me, it was really interesting just because it was, for me, a totally different peat. The only other two peat sources I had were obviously Connemara and Schlieveleek, and both of those were using Scottish peat as opposed to Irish. So I had never had Irish peat before, and it took a few tries for me to kind of get used to it. I want to say, if you'll allow the phrase, like it was. I didn't think it was bad. It was more that I thought, okay, this is clearly something different. This is a different. Let's call it a terroir of peat. I mean, and Ireland itself, like I think something like 1/6 of the entire island is peat bogs, and relative to other countries, that's an extremely high percentage. It's one of the highest, relative percentages of landmass covered in peat bogs. And you mentioned there's a conservation effort to try to conserve those as a carbon sink and more. But with so much peat available on the island, I guess there's a two-part question. The first one is, why Ballytage as the source in the first place? And then was there a particular thought or consideration into using these two farms to pair with the peat as opposed to other ones that could have been paired?
Yeah. So why Ballyteague? I guess the short answer is that was the only guy we could find in that period of time who knew anything. Like, we were asking for a very specific thing. We're not asking for peat as a fuel source. I remember I said you have to get a little bit deeper. So there's not many people who, if peat is in Ireland, and I guess in Ireland it's to do with things like fuel source, but also gardening industry, and it gets dragged into other sectors. But what we're after is something quite specific, and there's very few people who have the knowledge and the wherewithal to sort of find what we're looking for. It's not like Scotland. It's not who intimately know what the connections, or the sort of certain who have an industry set up around peat sourcing for whiskey. That doesn't exist in Ireland. So there's very few people who know. So since then we've been able to explore other peat sources, and I think we've been roaming around until we found something which I think we're happy with. But it allows us to sort of play with that variation even within peat. And onto the farm. So these first two, they're from Carlow. It's a pretty good they're quite close by. It's a pretty good quick compare and contrast of the influence of peat on these farms. But we're actually moving from farm to farm. Last year now we distilled Bannow Island and Ballykilcavan, which we had released as some of our first single farm origin. In fact, our first two single farm origins back in 2020. So we've peated, I believe we peated the County Waterford farm as well. So we're playing around. I think there's not so much of a logic necessarily around doing any two farms for any specific reason, but actually we're just exploring because we can. We're peating to different peat levels. I think, and the Bannow Island and Ballykilcavern went up to 70 or 80 ppm. I'll have to speak to Neil, our head brewer, to get the exact spec for what we've done. We're actually bringing out another couple of peated whiskies later this year. One of which it will be Lacan, which we actually released as a single palm origin to France a couple of years ago. So if you can track down that bottling, there should be plenty of it around because they're quite big bottlings. Then you can compare peated and unpeated and play along. And we're just, I mean, the peat is quite good to sort of see the differences or the influence of terroir and does it stand up to peat. And I think anyone who tries these whiskies can tell, they feel fundamentally different, even after the peat and even after all this other stuff, which people say, oh, terroir couldn't possibly exist because of all these variables. But we've smoked a bugger as much as we can, and still terroir, sort of trumps peat. So it's genuinely fascinating for that reason alone. But yeah, we're just having fun. We're just having fun with these.
And that comes across in certainly in how you're describing it, also how Mark describes it, that just having fun. I think you use that exact phrase, that this is all just, you're able to play around and have fun with the equipment that you've gotten, the resources available, which that too, I mean, I know the focus on kind of people as terroir or people as let's call it the sense of place, because that's what Dave Broom's been using, and I really like that phrase. When people are having fun picking your products,
it's an interesting phrase. A sense of place, a sense of place. I mean, I haven't actually read that book in particular, but you can get peated and unpeated islands, you can get peated and unpeated Speyside Highlands. It's all. I'd be intrigued to know that sort of the idea of a sense of place, but from our point of view, it isn't actually a sense of place. It's not a sense of anything. It's literally that place. It's directly, absolutely, totally that place, and you can taste that place. It's not a sense of anything. I think that's where maybe we would differ to much of the industry, and particularly those sort of ideas, which I think are very noble and done for good reasons. But we want to be very precise about it. It's literally that place. It is literally that plant. It is literally those compounds coming from here, not what what head distiller Ned had for breakfast that morning and his feeling and what he influenced on the spirits, or anything like that. It's the plant. It's literally the place. That's that's what terroir really is. And I think this is my beef with the idea of social terroir and these other ideas. They sort of very politely and unintentionally, or perhaps in some cases intentionally, muddy the term. And it doesn't need to be muddied. It's not that complicated. It's the influence of soil, microclimate, place, the environment on a plant, and that plant's interaction with the environment, how that plant grows, what flavor compounds we as distillers can get from it, and what you can taste in your glass at the end of it. It's very literal. It's very precise. And I think that's my sort of my personal sort of gripes, because I'm a words fan. At the end of the day, I like words, and I think there's a sort of an unintentional muddying of terroir, where terroir, just because it's French, doesn't have that sort of literal translation. It is quite precise. It is quite, and it gets muddied, and people can get confused by it. But it's very simple. Anyone who gardens, knows this stuff. Anyone who farms, they do this stuff. But a French word just sort of maybe confuses everyone about it, and then you can muddy it with these other terms. And I just think it doesn't need to be. It's actually, as soon as you accept this is a very precise, real thing, then just wow, what a frontier that opens up. Just simply accepting this, then right, just go all in and see what other things you can get from it, and what this might do in other distilling categories, or What could you do in England, or other more liberal, more with more liberal rules. Once you accept terroir, there's so many cool things you could just crack on with.
And so because there are so many potentialities there, I think I want to close out with this question about the kind of the 30,000-foot view of distilling in Ireland. So, as we're recording, we're up to, it's over 25 now that are active. Distillery is now 50 if you include the ones that are coming online in the next couple of years. An insane number that a couple of years ago no one would have anticipated. And each has had kind of a different experience, and each are aiming for something a little different. So for Waterford being so driven by this idea of terroir, whatever that may mean, person by person, but also project by project. I'm curious about interactions with the IWA and the kind of authorities in general. Like, have you had resistance from them? Have they been supportive? Has there really been no issue either way?
Good question. We sort of run in sort of parallel streams. It's almost as if we're sort of, when you're driving those roads sometimes and you see someone driving in parallel roads, but you're not really on the same road, you're just doing your own thing. And that feels very much like us in the IWA and much of the industry, actually. We're doing our own thing. We don't pay too much attention to the sort of politics of it. I don't think necessarily they would help us out too much. We're not that interested in what they not what they have to say. That sounds a bit facetious, but we're just doing our own thing, in all honesty. It's a very interesting point about the numbers of producers and the way Ireland's changed in category. And I think it's genuinely really exciting, actually, a really exciting place, some really cool things going on. But I remember how many years ago going through Dublin Airport, and you saw countless brands on the shelf, and there were only 4 distilleries in Ireland. And you think, well, where are these all coming from then? There are thousands of them. And they're all Irish, but there's only 4 distilleries. Obviously, a lot of independent bottling, lots of Cooley and Bushmill stuff being recycled. There's all sorts. Now the difficulty today is you still travel through Dublin Airport, and there are still thousands of brands. And I think the consumer doesn't necessarily know what was the real brand and what is a bottler, or who's actually a distillery, who's actually an independent bottler. It's all very muddied. I think this is the legacy problem Ireland's got. It's not always clear what it is or what the claims are, or it hasn't been. I think they're trying to sort it out. I mean, our interactions with the authorities tend to be it got moved around quite a bit quite recently, actually, from in terms of the label, what you can write on a label, what your claims can be on a label, your statements. It got moved it's back into the government now. I think it was a separate department that oversaw these claims and reviewed your labels when you submitted to them. And that's been absorbed into the government now. So I'm not sure really what the IWA is up to. I think the Scotch Whisky Association have a closer connection post Brexit, to obviously have more of a voice in Europe, considering they probably don't have the same voice post Brexit. So maybe there's more sort of learnings between them that are going on. But like I said, we don't really doing our own thing. And I don't want to say we don't care in a facetious way, but we don't really care. We are genuinely exploring flavour. We're making single malt whiskey. It is, I suppose, more traditionally a Scottish style of distillation anyway. But we're doing our own thing. We're sharing as much as we can with people. We're as transparent as anyone can get. The bodies that we work with tend to be more like, so in Ireland, you've got Board Beer, which are a great sort of food and drinks body, governmental body, and they do a lot of great promotional stuff. So we're good friends with those people. The Organic Trust, we're very close to the Organic Trust in Ireland, and Demeter and the Biodynamics front. That tends to be UK and Ireland, all in one go. Those are the companies I would say we have more contact with on a regular basis. Certainly, I don't think I can't even remember any email exchanges we've had with the IWA. So maybe they think very little of us as well. I don't know. Who can say? But I mean, there was certainly, Mark, when he was at Brookladdy, those of us with long memories can remember some of the antics he would get up to against the SWA. So I guess from the get go, he's not really had much interest in working with them. Now, I'm sure actually, as for some of the smaller producers, being part of an organization like that probably gives them a bit more clout, but it gives them more gravity. I mean, there was just back in the day, a few years ago, we did talk about, is it worth setting up a smaller independent body of craft distillers who could do something? But that the problem is we're all small companies and we're too busy doing our own things and nothing ever gets done. I mean, this is a long and roundabout way of just reiterating that point is we've got a very clear idea of what we're doing. And Mark's not interested in listening to that to other people necessarily. What can they say about distilling that we're not doing already? How can they influence what we're doing? I couldn't tell you.
I think it seems like, especially either with the IWA or with the Irish Technical Files, whichever way you want to go, as long as you're following, within the guidelines of 3+ years, the specificities of Irish grain and such, it doesn't seem like they're going to be going after you like the SWA went after like Highland. There's a Virginia distillery that used the word Highland because Virginia has highlands geographically. But they went up. So
I guess
it seemed like they leave you alone.
A very different sort of world, I guess. But I mean, it's a very basic technical file. I know there are some very good producers who are having all sorts of interesting arguments about recipes and what actually, I suppose when you get into it, what actually Irish whiskey is, because that technical file was written by some of the major companies, or one of the major companies really, a few years ago, and now it's actually realized it's got to, and that was all right, as I said, when you had just 4 distilleries as you walked through Dublin Airport, and there were 4 distilleries and 1,000 brands. Well, the technical file was still sort of fit for purpose back then, but I guess it's that's probably where Irish whiskey now has to look, is to be more inclusive perhaps of these craft operators and the very noble and good things that they are doing. But hey, we're just doing our own thing.
All right, so I think we're gonna have to leave it there for this episode. But in case you couldn't tell, there's gonna be more coming from the Whiskey Ring podcast and Waterford Whiskey. There are several topics still to get to that I hope to have some, Mark's help, have him come back on, have other staff members as well and team members to talk about even more about the terroir and even more about the casking. There's just so much to explore with this distillery and the process they're going into that, I certainly hope this won't be the last interview with Waterford. In the meantime, when the episode comes out, as usual, there will be show notes with all the links to Waterford, the website where you can buy social media reviews of what I've gotten to taste, and that includes the peated versions, the Hunter, the Gaia, Luna, Biodynamic. The Gaia was the organic, before I forget that one as well. So there is a lot on the website already, but there's also a lot more to come. So Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to talk through and give us really an in-depth overview of an incredibly complex facility that you guys are working on now, and all the projects that are inherent in that distillery. So really appreciate it.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to speak to you, and actually to engage in curious conversation. It's actually, when you look at how flavor is made or where flavor comes from, it's actually a really cool conversation. So really pleased to be able to just shoot the breeze. And like I said, there's a lot of us involved. I mean, the heroes are in production at Waterford. There's a lot of us there and we've got a lot of things to say, so I'm sure they'll be delighted to come back.
Fantastic. Well, with that, I will see you all next week. Hang on for the end credits just to hear how you can support the podcast, where you can find more information about us. And with that, I will see you next week. And Mark, just hang out for a sec with me. Hey folks, thanks for listening to another episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. If you like what you hear, please go ahead and click that subscribe, follow, or like button. Leave a rating and review on your podcast app of choice, and let me know what you want to hear. You can reach out to me through the podcast apps or email me at david@whiskeymyweddingring.com with any suggestions or ideas for new show guests. You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/whiskey in my wedding ring. That's whiskey with an E, for as little as $1 a month. $5 a month gets you access to bonus content, including our soon-to-resume Under the Influencer series, and $25 a month means you join the Barrel Share Club. Each month, Barrel Share Club members get to try products sent to me for review, bottles from my own collection, and sometimes bottles that I just pick up because they're fun or interesting. Right now, only 5 spots remain in the Barrel Share Club, so grab your place today. Finally, please follow on Instagram. You can follow me at Whiskey in My Wedding Ring or at Whiskey Ring Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Whiskey Ring. You can follow on Facebook at Whiskey in My Wedding Ring or join the Facebook group, the Whiskey Ringers group. And I hope to see you there. Cheers, thank you for the support, and see you next time.